Bouvard and Pécuchet. Chapter 1. Kindred Souls. As there were 33 degrees of heat, the boulevard Bourdon was absolutely deserted. Farther down, the Canal Saint-Martin, confined by two locks, showed in a straight line its water black as ink. In the middle of it was a boat filled with timber, and on the bank were 2 rows of casks. Beyond the canal, between the houses which separated the timber yards, the great pure sky was cut up into plates of ultramarine, and under the reverberating light of the sun, the white facades, the slate roofs, and the granite wharves glowed dazzlingly. In the distance arose a confused noise in the warm atmosphere, and the idleness of Sunday, as well as the melancholy engendered by the summer heat, seemed to shed around a universal languor. 2 men made their appearance. One came from the direction of the Bastille, the other from that of the Jardin des Plantes. The taller of the pair, arrayed in linen cloth, walked with his hat back, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and his cravat in his hand. The smaller, whose form was covered with a maroon frock coat, wore a cap with a pointed peak. As soon as they reached the middle of the boulevard, they sat down at the same moment on the same seat. In order to wipe their foreheads, they took off their headgear, each placing his beside himself, and the little man saw Bouvard written in his neighbor's hat, while the latter easily traced Pécuchet in the cap of the person who wore the frock coat. "Look here," he said. "We have both had the same idea, to write our names in our head coverings." "Yes, faith, for they might carry off mine from my desk. 'Tis the same with me. I am an employé." Then they gazed at each other. Bouvard's agreeable visage quite charmed Pécuchet. His blue eyes, always half closed, smiled in his fresh-colored face. His trousers, with big flaps, which creased at the end over beaver shoes, took the shape of his stomach and made his shirt bulge out at the waist, and his fair hair, which of its own accord grew in tiny curls, gave him a somewhat childish look. He kept whistling continually with the tips of his lips. Bouvard was struck by the serious air of Pécuchet. One would have thought that he wore a wig, so flat and black were the locks which adorned his high skull. His face seemed entirely in profile, on account of his nose, which descended very low. His legs, confined in tight wrappings of lasting, were entirely out of proportion with the length of his bust. His voice was loud and hollow. This exclamation escaped him. "How pleasant it would be in the country!" But, according to Bouvard, the suburbs were unendurable on account of the noise of the public houses outside the city. Pécuchet was of the same opinion. Nevertheless, he was beginning to feel tired of the capital, and so was Bouvard. And their eyes wandered over heaps of stones for building, over the hideous water in which a truss of straw was floating, over a factory chimney rising towards the horizon. Sewers sent forth their poisonous exhalations. They turned to the opposite side, and they had in front of them the walls of the public granary. Decidedly, and Pécuchet was surprised at the fact, it was still warmer in the street than in his own house. Bouvard persuaded him to put down his overcoat. As for him, he laughed at what people might say about him. Suddenly, a drunken man staggered along the footpath, and the pair began a political discussion on the subject of working men. Their opinions were similar, though perhaps Bouvard was rather more liberal in his views. A noise of wheels sounded on the pavement amid a whirlpool of dust. It turned out to be 3 hired carriages which were going towards Bercy, carrying a bride with her bouquet, citizens in white cravats, ladies with their petticoats huddled up so as almost to touch their armpits, 2 or 3 little girls, and a student. The sight of this wedding party led Bouvard and Pécuchet to talk about women, whom they declared to be frivolous, waspish, obstinate. In spite of this, they were often better than men, but at other times they were worse. In short, it was better to live without them. For his part, Pécuchet was a bachelor. As for me, I'm a widower, said Bouvard, and I have no children. Perhaps you are lucky there, but in the long run, solitude is very sad. Then, on the edge of the wharf, appeared a girl of the town with a soldier, sallow, with black hair and marked with smallpox. She leaned on the soldier's arm, dragging her feet along and swaying on her hips. When she was a short distance from them, Bouvard indulged in a coarse remark. Pécuchet became very red in the face, and, no doubt to avoid answering, gave him a look to indicate the fact that a priest was coming in their direction. The ecclesiastic slowly descended the avenue, along which lean elm trees were placed as landmarks, and Bouvard, when he no longer saw the priest's three-cornered headpiece, expressed his relief, for he hated Jesuits. Pécuchet, without absolving them from blame, exhibited some respect for religion. Meanwhile, the twilight was falling, and the window blinds in front of them were raised. The passers-by became more numerous. 7 o'clock struck. Their words rushed on in an inexhaustible stream, remarks succeeding to anecdotes, philosophic views to individual considerations. They disparaged the management of the bridges and causeways, the tobacco administration, the theatres, our marine, and the entire human race, like people who had undergone great mortifications. In listening to each other, both found again some ideas which had long since slipped out of their minds, and though they had passed the age of simple emotions, they experienced a new pleasure, a kind of expansion, the tender charm associated with their first appearance on life's stage. 20 times they had risen and sat down again, and had proceeded along the boulevard from the upper to the lower lock, each time intending to take their departure, but not having the strength to do so, held back by a kind of fascination. However, they came to parting at last, and they had clasped each other's hands, when Bouvard said, all of a sudden, "Faith, what do you say to our dining together?" "I had the very same idea in my own head," returned Pécuchet, "but I hadn't the courage to propose it to you." And he allowed himself to be led towards a little restaurant facing the Hôtel de Ville, where they would be comfortable. Bouvard called for the menu. Pécuchet was afraid of spices, as they might inflame his blood. This led to a medical discussion. Then they glorified the utility of science, how many things could be learned, how many researches one could make, if one had only time. Alas, earning one's bread took up all one's time, and they raised their arms in astonishment, and were near embracing each other over the table on discovering that they were both copyists, Bouvard in a commercial establishment, and Pécuchet in the Admiralty, which did not, however, prevent him from devoting a few spare moments each evening to study. He had noted faults in Monsieur Thiers' work, and he spoke with the utmost respect of a certain professor named Dumouchel. Bouvard had the advantage of him in other ways. His hair, watch chain, and his manner of whipping up the mustard sauce revealed the grey-beard, full of experience. And he ate with the corners of his napkin under his armpits, giving utterance to things which made Pécuchet laugh. It was a peculiar laugh, one very low note, always the same, emitted at long intervals. Bouvard's laugh was explosive, sonorous, uncovering his teeth, shaking his shoulders, and making the customers at the door turn round to stare at him. When they had dined, they went to take coffee in another establishment. Pécuchet, on contemplating the gas burners, groaned over the spreading torrent of luxury. Then, with an imperious movement, he flung aside the newspapers. Bouvard was more indulgent on this point. He liked all authors indiscriminately, having been disposed in his youth to go on the stage. He had a fancy for trying balancing feats with a billiard cue and 2 ivory balls, such as Barberoux, one of his friends, had performed. They invariably fell, and, rolling along the floor between people's legs, got lost in some distant corner. The waiter, who had to rise every time to search for them on all fours under the benches, ended by making complaints. Pécuchet picked a quarrel with him. The coffee-house keeper came on the scene, but Pécuchet would listen to no excuses and even cavilled over the amount consumed. He then proposed to finish the evening quietly at his own abode, which was quite near, in the Rue Saint-Martin. As soon as they had entered, he put on a kind of cotton nightgown and did the honors of his apartment. A deal desk, placed exactly in the center of the room, caused inconvenience by its sharp corners, and all around, on the boards, on the 3 chairs, on the old armchair, and in the corners, were scattered pell-mell a number of volumes of the Jorge Encyclopedia, the Magnetizer's Manual, a Fenelon, and other old books, with heaps of waste paper, 2 cocoa nuts, various medals, a Turkish cap, and shells brought back from the Havre by Dumochel. A layer of dust velveted the walls, which otherwise had been painted yellow. The shoe-brush was lying at the side of the bed, the coverings of which hung down. On the ceiling could be seen a big black stain, produced by the smoke of the lamp. Bouvard, on account of the smell, no doubt, asked permission to open the window. "The papers will fly away," cried Pécuchet, who was more afraid of the currents of air. However, he panted for breath in this little room, heated since morning by the slates of the roof. Bouvard said to him, "If I were in your place, I would remove my flannel." "What?" And Pécuchet cast down his head, frightened at the idea of no longer having his healthful flannel waistcoat. "Let me take the business in hand," resumed Bouvard. "The air from outside will refresh you." At last Pécuchet put on his boots again, muttering, "Upon my honor, you are bewitching me." And, notwithstanding the distance, he accompanied Bouvard as far as the latter's house at the corner of the Rue de Béthune, opposite the Pont de la Tournelle. Bouvard's room, the floor of which was well waxed, and which had curtains of cotton cambric and mahogany furniture, had the advantage of a balcony overlooking the river. The 2 principal ornaments were a liquor frame in the middle of the chest of drawers, and, in a row beside the glass, daguerreotypes representing his friends. An oil painting occupied the alcove. "My uncle," said Bouvard, and the taper which he held in his hand shed its light on the portrait of a gentleman. Red whiskers enlarged his visage, which was surmounted by a forelock curling at its ends. His huge cravat, with the triple collar of his shirt, and his velvet waistcoat and black coat, appeared to cramp him. You would have imagined there were diamonds on his shirt frill. His eyes seemed fastened to his cheekbones, and he smiled with a cunning little air. Pécuchet could not keep from saying, "One would rather take him for your father." "He is my godfather," replied Bouvard carelessly, adding that his baptismal name was François Denis Bartholomé. Pécuchet's baptismal name was Juste Romain Cyril, and their ages were identical, 47 years. This coincidence caused them satisfaction, but surprised them, each having thought the other much older. They next vented their admiration for Providence, whose combinations are sometimes marvelous. For, in fact, if we had not gone out a while ago to take a walk, we might have died before knowing each other. And having given each other their employers' addresses, they exchanged a cordial good night. "Don't go to see the women," cried Bouvard on the stairs. Pécuchet descended the steps without answering this coarse jest. Next day, in the space in front of the establishment of Monsieur Descambeaux Brothers, manufacturers of Alsatian tissues, 92 Rue Hautefeuille, a voice called out, "Bouvard! Monsieur Bouvard!" The latter glanced through the window panes and recognized Pécuchet, who articulated more loudly, "I am not ill. I have remained away." "Why, though?" "This," said Pécuchet, pointing at his breast. All the talk of the day before, together with the temperature of the apartment and the labors of digestion, had prevented him from sleeping, so much so that, unable to stand it any longer, he had flung off his flannel waistcoat. In the morning he recalled his action, which fortunately had no serious consequences, and he came to inform Bouvard about it, showing him in this way that he had placed him very high in his esteem. He was a small shopkeeper's son, and had no recollection of his mother, who died while he was very young. At 15 he had been taken away from a boarding school to be sent into the employment of a process server. The gendarme invaded his employer's residence one day, and that worthy was sent off to the galleys, a stern history which still caused him a thrill of terror. Then he had attempted many callings: apothecary's apprentice, usher, bookkeeper in a packet-boat on the Upper Seine. At length, a head of a department in the Admiralty, smitten by his handwriting, had employed him as a copying clerk. But the consciousness of a defective education, with the intellectual needs engendered by it, irritated his temper, and so he lived altogether alone, without relatives, without a mistress. His only distraction was to go out on Sunday to inspect public works. The earliest recollections of Bouvard carried him back across the banks of the Loire into a farmyard. A man, who was his uncle, had brought him to Paris to teach him commerce. At his majority, he got a few thousand francs. Then he took a wife and opened a confectioner's shop. 6 months later, his wife disappeared, carrying off the cash box. Friends, good cheer, and above all idleness, had speedily accomplished his ruin. But he was inspired by the notion of utilizing his beautiful chirography, and for the past 12 years he had clung to the same post in the establishment of Messieurs Descambeaux Brothers, manufacturers of tissues, 92 Rue Hautefeuille. As for his uncle, who formerly had sent him the celebrated portrait as a memento, Bouvard did not even know his residence, and expected nothing from him. 1,500 francs a year and his salary as copying clerk enabled him every evening to take a nap at a coffee-house. Thus their meeting had the importance of an adventure. They were at once drawn together by secret fibers. Besides, how can we explain sympathies? Why does a certain peculiarity, a certain imperfection, indifferent or hateful in one person, prove a fascination in another? That which we call the thunderbolt is true as regards all the passions. Before the month was over, they thou'd and thee'd each other. Frequently they came to see each other at their respective offices. As soon as one made his appearance, the other shut up his writing desk, and they went off together into the streets. Bouvard walked with long strides, whilst Pécuchet, taking innumerable steps, with his frock-coat flapping at his heels, seemed to slip along on rollers. In the same way, their peculiar tastes were in harmony. Bouvard smoked his pipe, loved cheese, regularly took his half-glass of brandy. Pécuchet snuffed at dessert, ate only preserves, and soaked a piece of sugar in his coffee. One was self-confident, flighty, generous, the other prudent, thoughtful, and thrifty. In order to please him, Bouvard desired to introduce Pécuchet to Barberoux. He was an ex-commercial traveller and now a pursemaker, a good fellow, a patriot, a ladies' man, and one who affected the language of the faubourg. Pécuchet did not care for him, and he brought Bouvard to the residence of Dumouchel. This author, for he had published a little work on mnemonics, gave lessons in literature at a young ladies' boarding school, and had orthodox opinions and a grave deportment. He bored Bouvard. Neither of the two friends concealed his opinion from the other. Each recognized the correctness of the other's view. They altered their habits, they quitting their humdrum lodgings, and ended by dining together every day. They made observations on the plays at the theatre, on the government, the dearness of living, and the frauds of commerce. From time to time, the history of Collier or the trial of Fualdes turned up in their conversations. And then they sought for the causes of the revolution. They lounged along by the old curiosity shops. They visited the School of Arts and Crafts, Saint-Denis, the Gobelin, the Invalides, and all the public collections. When they were asked for their passports, they made pretense of having lost them, passing themselves off as two strangers, two Englishmen. In the galleries of the museum, they viewed the stuffed quadrupeds with amazement, the butterflies with delight, and the metals with indifference. The fossils made them dream, the conchological specimens bored them. They examined the hothouses through the glass, and groaned at the thought that all these leaves distilled poisons. What they admired about the cedar was that it had been brought over in a hat. At the Louvre, they tried to get enthusiastic about Raphael. At the Great Library, they desired to know the exact number of volumes. On one occasion, they attended at a lecture on Arabic at the College of France, and the professor was astonished to see these two unknown persons attempting to take notes. Thanks to Barberoux, they penetrated into the green room of a little theatre. Dumichel got them tickets for a sitting at the Academy. They inquired about discoveries, read the prospectuses, and this curiosity developed their intelligence. At the end of a horizon growing every day more remote, they perceived things at the same time confused and marvelous. When they admired an old piece of furniture, they regretted that they had not lived at the period when it was used, though they were absolutely ignorant of what period it was. In accordance with certain names, they imagined countries only the more beautiful in proportion to their utter lack of definite information about them. The works, of which the titles were to them unintelligible, appear to their minds to contain some mysterious knowledge. And the more ideas they had, the more they suffered. When a mail coach crossed them in the street, they felt the need of going off with it. The key of flowers made them sigh for the country. One Sunday they started for a walking tour early in the morning, and, passing through Meudon, Bellevue, Suresnes, and Auteuil, they wandered about all day amongst the vineyards, tore up wild poppies by the sides of fields, slept on the grass, drank milk, ate under the acacias in the gardens of country inns, and got home very late, dusty, worn out, and enchanted. They often renewed these walks. They felt so sad next day that they ended by depriving themselves of them. The monotony of the desk became odious to them. Always the eraser and the sandarach, the same inkstand, the same pens, and the same companions. Looking on the latter as stupid fellows, they talked to them less and less. This cost them some annoyances. They came after the regular hour every day, and received reprimands. Formerly they had been almost happy, but their occupation humiliated them since they had begun to set a higher value on themselves, and their disgust increased while they were mutually glorifying and spoiling each other. Pécuchet contracted Bouvard's bluntness, and Bouvard assumed a little of Pécuchet's moroseness.